Hello everyone, my name is Albert Larson, and the title of this presentation is Holistic Water Cycle Analysis via the Confluence of Climate Model, Satellite, Ground Truth, and Machine Learning Signal Processing Technologies. It's a case of two North American Transboundary River watersheds. So for the agenda today, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the work covered within, talk about the curiosity that led to this work, and then dig in a little bit closer to the data, the treatment that was performed on the data under investigation, and then finally the results that we got as a function of using that data with a particular treatment over a certain number of experiments. So a little bit of background on this work. It's the final chapter of my dissertation. My dissertation is titled Flux to Flow, a clear review of Earth's water cycle via neural networks and satellite data. I completed and defended my dissertation this past May at the University of Rhode Island. The first chapter of my dissertation, I used one particular neural network called Discern, which stands for a Deep Convolutional Residual Regressive Neural Network. I used GLDAS flux inputs. GLDAS is a product produced by NASA Goddard and their partners. It's called the Global Land Data Assimilation System. And I used the United States Geologic Survey's gauged streamflow outputs. Chapter 2 of my dissertation, I used that same Discern neural network. Two inputs to the network, one input and one output, AMSORI and MODIS, both from the Aqua satellite. And that I also used the in situ analysis system as a target. It's a production of a raster data set for float measurements of sea surface temperature. So along the way of completing that work, I found that I was dealing with non-numerical values relatively frequently, otherwise known as NANs, more commonly known as NANs. And they just seemed to be a pain point. And what I also was discovering was that there was a great number of these when you would look at either the land data, like with GLDAS, and then the sea data, like for example with MODIS. So for the third chapter, the coherent question that I wanted to ask is, well, what's the impact on streamflow prediction that I was performing in the first paper when I actually go and take the data set that I was using in the second paper? And how does it improve or worsen our ability to forecast streamflow? So for this experiment, I looked at two different basins. The Yukon Basin, predominantly in Alaska, but also in Canada, Yukon Territory. And I also looked at the Columbia Basin, which covers a great part of the United States of America and trails into Canada. For the Yukon Basin, I was able to obtain 6 streamflow gauges with continuous measurements from the year 2002 to 2020. 3 of them were from the USGS, United States Basins. 3 of them were Canadian gauges. And you can see them all illustrated here, the 6 gauges that we were looking at. The units are in cubic feet per second, which is akin to a velocity over the area of a channel. So a stream has a particular geometry to where the water flows through it, and we can capture that information. It's relatively static, and we can also go and capture the velocity, and using those 2 measurements we can get a continuous measurement of stream flow. Here of note, there are 2 of the channels, actually both of the Canadian, 2 of the Canadian measurements we found to be of low flow. So you can see those broken out at the bottom. With the Columbia Basin, we were able to get 7 continuous measurements from 2002 to 2020. 5 of them from the United States, 2 of them from Canada, and as you can see, one of the Canadian bases is of a relatively low flow. Generally speaking, all of the signals are just looking at this one right here, it does seem that there's a seasonal low where this particular basin at the bottom, 08NE 087, might have no flow. It might freeze over in the winter months, but then pick up again in the spring and as it melts into the summer and fall. So moving to the satellite observations, we again reused from papers 1 and paper 2 GLDAS, the Global Land Data Assimilation Systems observation of QS surface runoff as well as QSB subsurface runoff. These are both solutions from meteorological inputs of water G and energy flux algorithms. In this particular case, we used the NOAA algorithm. It's a runoff or a chaotic flow, which we regard to as a flux. And then MODIS is a sea surface temperature. We used level 3, the thermal, at a monthly frequency, 9 kilometer resolution, and only the unit observations. As you can see here, row 1 is just the GLDAS. Row 2 is GLDAS, and then on the second column, it's with the inclusion of sea surface temperature. And then finally, what we've gone and done in row 3 is we're looking at 2 different color maps. In row 2, column 2, you can see that the GLDAS observations get washed out because of the large dynamic range of sea surface temperature. So to make it more clear, we broke them out into 2 different color maps. We performed roughly 2,000 experiments with 5 different neural nets, 960 experiments per basin, 6 different lag profiles, 4 training test split percentages. We tried using z-scored satellite data, and then we also shuffled and did not shuffle the training data. As you can see in the plot here, the title of each is 4 neuron, 30 neuron, 200 neuron, 1000 neuron, and then discern as you go through the columns. And what we're finding is that whether or not we use no sea surface temperature or we do use sea surface temperature, as the complexity increases, so does the performance of the neural network, according to the input data, here being Yukon. We measure the performance according to the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency, which is a commonly used hydrological figure of merit, where they look at how well a model does at predicting what the actual streamflow is. What we found is that better performance actually does occur with the sea surface temperature included, which you can see in columns 2, 3, 4 of note. And the same is true of the Columbia Basin. In columns 2, 3, and 4, you can see with sea surface temperature, Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency is between 0 and 1 and tracking towards 1, as opposed to with no sea surface temperature and the exact same neural network, you're having negative value performances. In the experiments within this publication, we found that Yukon is generally more predictable. This basin performance heterogeneity, while employing the discern structure in particular, here we look at discern in the 1000 neuron, follows our first manuscript. No matter what data we use when we fix the neural network, we find that the basin itself does have some unique trait. So in conclusion, what we did here is we built on a curiosity of what happens when we combined land and sea observations of the water cycle and use them to predict streamflow. We found that when doing this, adding sea surface temperature, we are met with a markedly better prediction of streamflow. Going forward, we think it's imperative to use sea surface temperature in these hydrological analyses. Thanks, and hope to hear from you soon.